Welcome back to the Global Report. I'm your host, Morgan Dawicki. I'm very excited today to have Lydia Piccolo, who is a student at American University. I'm an American University alum, so this is kind of a fun episode for me. You are studying broadcast journalism. You're a news staff writer at the Eagle, which is the American University student newspaper. You sort of had an exciting spring, for lack of a better term. So I thought it would be fun to get you on the podcast, talk about your experience, talk about what you saw this spring on college campuses. And so if you want to give us a little introduction of yourself, what are you studying? What's sort of exciting you at school right now?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, like you said, I'm a rising senior at American University. I've been with the Eagle now for 3 years. So I think it's been 3 years. I started with them as an audio producer and shifted to news staff writer. I'll preface, all of my opinions here today are my own. I don't represent the paper, don't represent anybody else's experience in this coverage, but I will speak a lot about my coverage at the encampment this past spring that we got to go through in our final season, which was very exciting. So I'm really excited to get into it. Yeah.
So what excited you to study journalism? How did you get into getting involved with the student newspaper at American?
Yeah. So I originally came into AU, like many people who come to DC, excited to study policy, and specifically, I was focused in foreign policy. Ended up switched over to journalism after some nice soul searching, and then decided that, yeah, I was going to join the community paper. And the Eagle is completely student run, all undergrad students. We are also editorially independent, though we do receive school funding. So we have the opportunity to really, tell the stories that exist very poignantly on campus. Like I said, I started in audio. I actually didn't recently switch over until this past spring. I was given the opportunity in the fall. We had the very first demonstration on campus after October 7th. And I happened to be in the newsroom that morning. They needed people to go out and collect interviews, and I volunteered. Wasn't originally supposed to write, and then ended up on the story with some team members and was hooked. And then since then, I have continued protest coverage from a variety of stories. And then also, my biggest story was in February with our print edition, where we did a wide examination of what freedom of speech looks like on our college campus specifically, and then trying to put it in a broader perspective with everything that was happening. And then that transitioned into April's encampment, which got to kind of translate everything that I had been working on into one giant collection of 2 weeks of coverage. So it's been an exciting journey through all of it, and I've had such a wonderful team. But I'm really excited to talk about what that whole experience was like.
Yeah, I think this was very unique. Obviously, many people around the country saw coverage from, mainstream media outlets and vice versa, but you sort of had this unique perspective as a peer, as a colleague of students who were involved in these protests. So, what was that like, having to sort of ingrain yourself into those events, and also simultaneously sort of being a peer? How did you sort of perhaps disconnect yourself from any of the emotional stuff to sort of focus on the coverage of what was happening on the ground?
Yeah, yeah. I'll give a little background before I go, because we had a lot of conversations about the ethics and the separation, as most journalists do. Our encampment started, I believe it was on April 25th. So a week before our final started, we were on the tail, I believe it'd be Columbia encampment, which everyone was following, had been around for at least 5 days at that point. And our encampment was very unique in the fact that it was existed on a separate campus from the one that I was living on. Um, the encampment was housed on George Washington's campus, but it was not just George Washington University students, it was American University students, which was why we were there to cover. Um, so we had a unique situation as Eagle reporters that we were reporting on our AU students, but also at the same time, we were reporting on a community that we were not familiar with and that we were, like other media outlets, entering from outside in. So for us, a lot of the coverage that we had to pay, a lot of our approach to the coverage that we had to pay attention to was what was the best way to enter a community that, yes, other students exist within, but also we are not the students who exist within that community. What's the best way to protect ourselves as student journalists, as we are not like other large media outlets, we don't have a backing. We don't have anybody who can support us if we got arrested. We don't have anybody who could support us if there was legal issues with our publication when we're uploading at a rapid pace. So for us, there was a lot to navigate that we had never had to deal with before. Our team was wonderful. We had already heard murmurings of an encampment starting up a few days beforehand. So I happened to be in the group chat with, I think there were probably like 7 of us that were on call. And then that Thursday morning, we heard that it broke, that there would be an encampment by 2 p.m. that afternoon. As soon as my last class was done for the day, it was literally one of my last classes of the semester. I got in the car with an editor and my editor in chief, and we drove down to the encampment, and I was there, I think, for the next 12 hours. Um, it was pretty much a cycle through. We were there as much as we possibly could be until the barricades went up, and then we were only allowed to be in certain sections of the space. But the question of how we approached it as students versus journalists, I think, was really unique and very difficult. Um, I had a lot of moments where I would have conversations with people about how other media outlets, larger media outlets, were treating people within the encampment and people outside of the encampment. And it wasn't always pleasant. There was definitely, I think by the halfway point, there was definitely some frustration with media outlets that was not originally there. I know that organizers within the encampment had set up their own kind of press tent so that they could uh, minimize the amount of disruption that was coming from that. It seemed there was also a conversation, and we had this before the encampment even. We had a lot of issues of doxing from our coverage that we had to address, and I think that that was something that was not taken into account at all when when these stories were being published. Students were um, not aware of the seriousness that can come with your name being published online in association with either side of the issue. So for us, we have our own ethical protocols of how we approach these situations. I have my own personal ethical protocols. I try my best to be as unbiased as possible, but I cannot ignore the fact that I am a student deeply embedded in this community. I will have a different perspective from outlets watching in. And hopefully I can use that perspective, and I hope that I did use that perspective to benefit my reporting rather than harm it.
So, do you feel like the student protests were given sort of, it sounds like you believe the student protests were given an unfair sort of representation by sort of perhaps some of the more mainstream media? It sounds like after a couple days, a lot of sort of outside forces were having a lot of influence and um, drive over the narrative of what seemed to be happening. How did that sort of unfold? Did it feel uncomfortable to sort of witness it happening? Um, what was sort of the access like after a few days?
Yeah, I don't know if necessarily there was an unfair representation. I'm sure there are certain outlets that probably had more of a stronger stance on what was happening. We saw that nationwide with the coverage. Um, I think there was definitely, when I say more of like the interactions between outlets and students, it was more of, for us, we're approaching it as this is a student that I'm talking to. For them, they're just approaching it as any other source that they would be talking to. So that was kind of the difference in relation for us. Um, I think when we talk about outside sources being pushed into the encampment, what was so unique about this encampment again was that it was a coalition of multiple DMV schools. So I think it was around 8 DMV schools that were all present at that encampment, and then even I believe later on, we had people coming in from UVA. There was even a sign I remember because the DC mayor pointed this out that there was students who were from Columbia who would come to our encampment towards the end and were existing there. Um, but there was never a point, like I said, there was some level of contention, but I do think that that contention really just came from instances of bad interactions with people of the media. Again, there's already a level of distrust that can exist between um, protesters who, in this case, some were committing what now is they're being tried for trespassing, because we did eventually have, I believe it was 33 people arrested in one night. Um, so there is a level of, okay, who's working with who? Where is this line that who can I trust? Who's going to tell my story the way I want it to be told? Um, but the other thing I think that was really interesting that we saw play out for these students was the support of people who, again, from outside of their original community. So we had the coalition, but on top of that, you had people from all over the DMV who were not students also supporting this. Professors who, I remember, I think it was one of the early first nights when they originally had a curfew set in place. When the curfew came closer, all of the students were put into the center of the yard, and a large human chain was made around them as a form of protection, um, because there were conversations that there was going to be arrests. Um, and I also think the other thing that really was brought out in this experience and that was really highlighted was consistently the distrust and the clashing of students and their administration, which we've consistently seen. This is not anything new, but this was definitely a situation in which it was heightened, in which it was torn even further than it was before. And it's consistently continued to be that way on both their campus, on our campus, and on campuses around the country.
Do you feel ultimately like there was a coherent sort of goal behind the coalition? Do you think it strengthened sort of the resolve and the outcomes? What were sort of the perspectives you were hearing from students? I know um, for many protests, there was an underlying sort of divestment strategy, but do you feel like that was ultimately the goal, or was it more to raise national awareness behind the issue?
Yeah, so specifically for our coalition, they did have very specific demands for the universities, including divestment was one of the large ones. I know on uh, AU's campus, our chapter of Students Supporting Justice in Palestine was recently in the spring put on probation for protesting inside, which is against school policy. And then I believe also GW's chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine had also been put on probation. I believe it was back in the fall, though. So there were specific demands that this encampment did have, but also on the broader sense, yes, it was to raise awareness. There were fundraising efforts. There were, it was more about, to me, it seemed to be community building, because I kept running into the issue of, and I think we can touch on this later, of what happens at the end of next week when finals are over and everyone goes home. Does this still continue? What does that look like? And I think the organizers were aware of that. They were not naive to the fact that people were probably going to leave and go home eventually, and it wasn't going to be because everyone got arrested. That wasn't what was going to happen. It was going to be because the semester was over and students had to go home. But there was consistently the message, and you would hear them over the loudspeaker say, please remember why we're here. We're not here for ourselves. We're here for the people of Gaza. That was consistently their message. They also would say, find those local organizations when you go back home, find those communities that are continuing this movement, and participate in them. So that, I think, was a consistent message. I'm sure, and there definitely was muddling of messages that happens always, especially when you have such a large movement. Um, but again, for this specific one, they did at least have demands that they had given to the university. And they've had consistent demands that they've had moving forward. I believe now, at least on GW's campus, there are students who are banned from returning to the campus. And so the current movement, from what I've seen recently, has been to reverse those decisions against those students.
Interesting. So obviously, students went home for the summer. We've seen some sort of continuation over the summer on some campuses. The war continues to rage on. There's sort of no real change in action or behavior by Israel and sort of what these students are protesting. And U.S. policy hasn't been able to achieve much in convincing Israel to scale back. So come fall, if there's not a ceasefire agreement, do you think these encampments, I think protests will obviously come back, but do you envision the encampments sort of making a comeback as well?
Yeah, I think at least within the DMV area, I can speak specifically for here, we will see something of the sort. And the only reason I say that, the main reason I say that, is because DC is no stranger to encampments. There are multiple encampments still throughout the city, not of students, but of other organizers. So I think some form of that can come back, but I also do think that uh, universities will likely be taking precautionary steps to prevent incidences like these happening again. We've already, at least through the end of the semester, AU had a policy in place that said that they would not tolerate any form of encampment on our campus, and I believe that they will continue that in the fall. That's very likely. They want to continue their everyday activities, and this would be disruptive to that moving forward. But I do think it is very likely that we will continue to see protests throughout the rest of the continuation. DC's, again, like I said, DC is a very unique situation where we are very used to this. Our local authorities are used to this. It's not uncommon for these things to pop up at last minute's notice, and for them to go on for a while without even recognition. I mean, GW's president at the time had called for help of the DC Metro Police to help them remove people who were in the encampment. And DC Mayor said no for a period of time. She said, that's not my business. I'm not going to involve myself. Eventually, after call on her by House Republicans, she did eventually make the decision to help with that dispersal. But at the time, there was no involvement, and that was very specific and very unique to our situation. So it's likely, again, like I said, there will be similar situations. I do not think that we'll see it to the level that we saw it before. That was such a unique an individual situation that will be hard to replicate.
We've sort of seen over the past few years sort of single issue or identity politics sort of make a comeback. People are choosing to vote for a candidate based on issues like abortion. And now suddenly The issue of Israel-Palestine and Gaza is sort of becoming a single issue for voters. How is that impacting your generation and their sort of decisions to who they're going to vote for? If
Yeah, at least for the people that were in attendance to these events, there was a message of we will remember in November. So they're not going to forget when they go to the polls what this administration has done or what this administration has not done. Um, there obviously, I believe, have been conversations of people talking about, you know, they will not be voting for the presidential candidate um, because of the war. Um, but separate from that, I mean, there are a lot of issues that college students are paying attention to. I think I probably have a little bit more of a bubble of politically active students. So, comparison to other universities, AU is definitely a chatty campus.
anywhere in DC,
Yeah.
yep.
So there's issues that we're paying attention to that might not always necessarily be paid attention to by college students. But I mean, issues of environmental policy, issues of student debt, issues of identity politics, I think are definitely not going away anytime soon. And we will probably see students continue to take stances on those issues. And but I'm also, at least as somebody who will be voting, I am proud of our generation for the amount of students who are so politically active, not just students, people of my generation who are so politically active and who are exercising their right to vote, because that is so incredibly important on a local and federal level. Um, so go out and vote. To everyone listening, go out and vote, no matter what. So, but yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out. I, especially living in DC, am excited to be here for the election, um, and excited to be around for better or for worse, uh, to see how it plays out. I wasn't here for January 6th, and I don't actually think many of us were here for January 6th because that was still during COVID and the whole campus was shut down. But we are prepping a little bit, at least on the paper, for what the fall and spring will look like for our coverage, because we're anticipating a similar uh, not I shouldn't say we're anticipating a similar, but there's the possibility of a similar year of 2016. It can run parallel to each other. And unfortunately, during 2016, AU was subject to a lot of outside harassment. Specifically, our student body president at the time was a Black woman who experienced very, very strong racial harassment. It was pretty bad at the time, and we're hoping that that does not happen again. But we do have to be prepared if there are, and we have to pay attention for incidences that could arise similar to that time when we had similar candidates up on the docket again.
So there's obviously a lot of sort of challenges going on in America. You know, we frame all these sort of existential threats. Climate change, is democracy under assault? Is your generation seeing these as things to be pessimistic about? Are you trying to tackle them and be optimistic and view them as opportunities? Sort of what's the ethos and the drive behind your generation at the moment?
Yeah, yeah. I like I said again, I think AU is a unique campus for the way that we're attacking these issues. Um, Back in January, like I was talking about before, I got the opportunity to examine freedom of speech on campus, and in doing that, we talked to a lot of organizers for a bunch of different issues on campus. I talked to climate organizers, I talked to free speech organizers, I was talking to labor union organizers, and all of them seem to be taking everything that they've learned from before and continuing with these issues. I never got the sense of pessimism from them specifically. Now, granted, they are people who are pushing this movement forward. They are the leaders of this movement. And so hopefully they are the ones, for their own sake, who are optimistic. Um, But I think there is a level of my generation, yes, that is definitely struggling with these issues that are being thrown at us, and we are being told that we're not always tackling them the correct way, and that we're trying to reverse things that have been done to us that are very difficult to reverse. Um, but it is not in my perspective, it is not a generation that is one that is going to give up. Um, we have to keep pushing forward, or else there is no reason to do what we're doing now. And so hopefully all of these issues we can find our own solutions for, um, and move forward from then. I mean, it will be very unique. No matter what happens, no matter what situation we end up with, it will be so incredibly its own, and we will have to figure out how to navigate it like we always have.
My final question for you: younger generations sort of always get a knock for not being in tune, not being naive, not really knowing what you're talking about. I think one of the sayings over the past 20 years is that America's gotten worse because we lack
Mm.
community, um, and there's different ways to shake that. Obviously, community can mean so many different things, but how community focused is your generation, and how are you sort of working together to lead change?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I am able to pull directly from a community focused background, as I come from a very small community in North Carolina, that I'm incredibly proud of. Um, and I think that for me, I have always been an incredibly small community based person because that's how I thrive. But I do think that the argument that we lack a substantial core of community is not one to be looked upon lightly. I think there is a level of what we are paying attention to that is on a broader scale than ever before. We have been handed uh, devices that give us access to the entire world and every issue that's ever existed ever. And so it gets very difficult to pay attention to the small, minute things that are happening a block away from us, because there's all of these massive things that are happening worlds away from us. So I think that that argument has validity, but I don't think that that argument can be used to cast aside the uh, movements that have taken shape. Uh, it feels kind of pointless at that point. But like my, um, but I have to remind myself to be aware of the communities that I exist within. For example, I'll use AU specifically because that's the community I belong to right now. We're a campus that has been told, even just recently, I've been covering the working group on freedom of expression that just released their findings for this past semester. About to release a story on that. Um, and in their findings, they had conversations about what freedom of speech looks like on campus, what freedom of speech exists like on AU's campus specifically. And one of the things that they pointed out was that AU lacked a format of community that allowed for those conversations, allowed for freedom of speech to exist at its full potential. And they didn't really have an answer on how to tackle those, but the first step was recognizing that that issue does exist. And then we can move from there. So I think that, yes, I'm sure we do get a little bit of a bad rep for separating ourselves from those local spaces, but also at the same time, paying attention to the bigger issue does not mean that you're not paying attention to the smaller issue. That answers that.
I
Yeah.
think it does. And this has been such a great conversation. You're incredibly smart and articulate, and it's
Thanks.
great to see what you're doing. Best of luck in senior
Thank you very
year,
much.
and keep up the
I
great work.
appreciate it. Yeah, thanks again for having me. Uh, hope that I was able to tackle all of it. And to anyone else who's interested to hear more about this or pay attention to what's happening in the fall, check out the Eagle. As always, support local journalism, because we've got our eyes and ears everywhere. And yeah, thanks again.
Cheers. Onward
There
and
we
upward.
go.